Hi, everyone. So it's just me today because Folgert fell ill yesterday. So I'm going to do the presentation in two parts today. I hope that we can keep an informal setting. We're going to see some pretty complex things. So whenever something is unclear, just interrupt me, ask questions, tell me if you don't agree, etc. So in the first part today, we're going to talk about the initial case study that we worked on in this research line. This is a research line that I developed with Folgert, with my brother in arms in all of these things. Just to set the stage in the first part. In the second part, I promise you that it will be more about actual history. I hope that you will like the second part. I myself am a literary historian, which isn't really a historian, as you know. But we do have a number of things in common, and that's what's on my first slide. So anyone who's studying the past, especially the human past, is confronted with the situation that we have to work with the material artifacts that remain from the past, but that their survival today is imperfect. And that's a problem that you have in history, art history, even musicology, but you also have it in paleontology, you have it in genetics, etc. So we're cursed to work with a historic record that is incomplete. What is important is that we don't know in which ways it is incomplete. And that's very important because that means that the historic record that we study is potentially biased towards items that have a higher survival probability than others. Stone tools, for instance, have a longer longevity than wooden tools. So today, the questions that we are addressing all circle around these two basic questions. How much has been lost and what has been lost? Why have these things been lost? So the first study that I'll present today is one from my home field and deals with chivalric literature from the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, as we like to call it. In my research, I focus on Northwestern Europe, and I look at these longer form narratives that all of the national philologies in Europe have their own word for. In Dutch, we call this ridder-epique. The French, they speak of chansons de geste, roman. Then you have the sagas in Northern Europe, etc. But generally, this is longer form narratives that deal with knights, heroes. It's a hero-centered fiction. If you don't know anything about this kind of literature, you can think of it as the equivalent of the present-day action hero movie. So there's always a male protagonist. There's a lot of fighting, a little love story running in the background. And as with these present-day movies, the quality, there's a lot of divergence in the quality of these movies. These aren't real movies. I often have to stress that. So we don't have an epic movie yet about Charlemagne, even though I think it would be great. So these narratives about King Arthur, about Charlemagne, we still know them because we have some manuscripts left. And this literature was produced before the invention of the printing press. It's a handwritten culture, and literature circulated in these books that were manually copied. These books were made out of parchments. These books were expensive. People like to compare them to sports cars nowadays. There is something to that analogy. They were bespoke objects and still pretty rare. Literacy rates were, of course, much lower than nowadays. And sometimes we're lucky and these manuscripts survive, but more often what we have is just fragments of manuscripts that we find. Parchment was a very durable material, and it often got recycled in later times. And when these parchment books weren't read anymore, people would cut them up into strips and use those in the spines of newer books. And lots of the literature, for instance, in Dutch, which I work on, we only know from these small strips. And people got very creative with this parchment. They would like make little boxes out of them. And there's a great example in Scandinavia that I'll show later, where they have a bishop, a Scandinavian bishop, who was wearing a mitre. And inside that mitre, they found a fragment of a pretty erotic romance that the guy was walking around with on his head. So this literature has survived in crazy ways, and often a bit, it's counterintuitive that we only know this literature because at some point somebody was trying to get rid of the book and destroyed the book. But that's interesting. Of course, when the only thing that you have left of a manuscript is a small parchment strip, often you don't know where it was produced, for whom it was produced, etc. So it can be really hard in the study of what we call fragmentology to situate these manuscripts. But there is one thing that we can always do, and that is we can count these manuscripts. And that's a very plain, easy thing that I would like to capitalize in the work that we talk about today. So often what we like to do as medievalists is we like to believe that the number of manuscripts that we still have of a particular romance, for instance, tells us something about the popularity of that romance back in medieval times. So if we still have lots of copies of a text by Chrétien de Troyes, for instance, we are going to assume that Chrétien de Troyes was a popular author. And that's sort of a theorem in medieval studies. What you see here is the copies that we still have of Middle English literature. You might have heard of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, for instance. There was a movie made of that. And what you can do is count how many copies we still have of these works. And then you get a plot that looks a bit like this. And what is very interesting is the shape of this data. This is what we call abundance data, where we simply count how abundant a certain work still is. What you see is that we have a very typical distribution with a very long tail. And you often see that whenever you work with historical artifacts. It's the same in Greek papyrology, where everything tends to be Homer, and then you have a long tail of obscure authors that nobody has ever heard of. And this sort of distribution, a log normal distribution with a heavy tail, is something that we see in culture, but also in other sciences. I'll come back to that. What is important, however, is that we cannot take these values at face value because of the simple reason that so many books have been lost. There might have been bias, so it's really dangerous to trust these numbers as they are. So books are fragile, and I often like to illustrate that with a case study or a dramatic story, really, from a place close to where I live, namely the Great Fire of Leuven. And this dates back to the early days of the Second World War. And today I'll often talk about the Second World War, which was really sort of a refrain in this kind of research. So the German troops were very quick to reach the city center of Leuven when the war broke out. And because of a misunderstanding, really, the entire city center was burned down. And in the fire, the university library was included. Leuven, as you might know, is one of the oldest universities in the entire world. And the entire library was destroyed. Really important manuscripts were lost there. It's a good illustration of the fragility of this kind of heritage. But the real tragedy is that this was in the First World War, sorry, and in the Second World War, the tragedy was that they had rebuilt the library in the interbellum, but the library got bombed again, and they again lost all of their books. And together it is estimated over 1 million books were destroyed in these events. So I find it still very difficult to imagine what 1 million books looks like. But this is a bit what happened to the dinosaurs, right? This is a mass extinction event then in the cultural domain. And today, if you're ever in Leuven, in the university library, they still put on display their Snow Whites. And these are like the ashy remains, the number of these books that somehow survived the fire, and they keep them in these beautiful glass boxes. Like, I think that is a very evocative image of cultural heritage, which is fragile, which we have to take good care of. Okay, so back to the medieval literature. So we're talking about the data. We've been talking about data models. So in our work, we have a very, very simple data model. And we're going to assume that in a certain literature, these romances, we have these works. You can see them to the left there. These are the gray circles. And these are stories, narratives that we know. And initially, in medieval times, each of these works will have circulated in at least one copy. And then scribes might have copied that copy onto other copies, etc. These are the little books that you see there in the documents column. So each work appears in at least one document initially, potentially more. And then history happens. And some of these books survived. That's what you see in the first line. Some of them were cut up, and only strips have survived. But many of them have been lost or haven't been retrieved yet. And if these items survive, then they end up in private collections, archives, libraries, etc. And that's where scholars can study them today. So today, what I'll be especially talking about are the examples B and D, or the works that we call forgotten. And what are forgotten works? Works of which no single copy is extant anymore today. Those are the ones that we don't know anymore. Those are the ones that we have forgotten. Well, what we would like to do is estimate how many of these works have been lost. And I'll say more about that in a minute, but until quite recently, we really had no idea. The number of works that were lost, it seems like a very hard quantity to estimate. So to try to solve this issue, we turn to ecology. Ecology, the study of life on Earth, of the abundance of life on Earth. And because of that reason, the notion of biodiversity or ecodiversity is very important in that field. That's a quantity that these ecologists like to monitor, for instance, to look at the effect of climate change or wildfires, etc. And biodiversity, a crucial number, but it's also a really hard number to estimate. So basically what you want to know is how many species are living during a certain period in a specific geographic area. So how do you estimate biodiversity? Basically, you send in a team of people, of ecologists, field workers, and they go to a certain area and they start counting the animals that they see. Often you can just do that with a pencil and paper. There might be camera traps, there might be actual traps, but that's how these people essentially work. They count the animals. The problem is, however, that no matter how long that you stay in a specific area, there will always be species that are living there, but that you never observed. Like a good example are snow leopards. Snow leopards, notoriously shy. They live during the night. They can be really hard to spot. There could also be very small species that you miss. And ecologists are very aware of. So they know that they get numbers back from the field workers, but they also know that these numbers are an underestimation of the actual diversity, of the actual species richness in that area. And they've realized that very early, and in ecology, they've established a beautiful, really rich tradition of statistical models that allow them to estimate how many species that they missed. So they're going to look at the data that they do have, because that data, in fact, contains information about the species that you missed, about the extent to which you underestimate the biodiversity. And the models that are used for this are sometimes called unseen species models. And today I'm going to be focusing on a method that is called CHA1. I'll say more about that in a minute, but that is a unseen species model that was developed by one of our co-authors, Han Chao, a brilliant Taiwanese biostatistician. So I said that some animals are hard to spot. Have you seen the snow leopard in this image? You might have seen this on social media. It's a very nice example because here I tell you there's a snow leopard, it's looking at you, but these animals are really, really hard to spot. So even if you know that it's there, it can be hard to observe. And this illustrates the idea of bias. The bias is that you think that there's no snow leopard. Anyone? Maybe it's a bit small. Yeah. And there's tons of other examples that you can find online. But even if you know that the animal must be there, it can be hard to observe it. So that's what these unseen species models try to solve. They're a way to remedy our own bias, if you will. Okay, so when ecologists go out and they start counting animals, they also end up with the kind of abundance data that I was showing for these medieval manuscripts earlier. Typically also a distribution with a very long tail. So of course you see lots of bunnies, you see lots of ants. These common animals, they tend to have really high sightings. The number of times you observe a species is what we call a sighting. And then you have a long tail of rare stuff, of rare animals. This is where the tigers are and the lions, so the predators that are hard to observe, owls, etc. So what they do in ecology is they're interested in the fact that this tail must have been much longer, right? Because the species that you didn't observe, the species have a sighting frequency of 0. And what this estimator, the CHA1 estimator does, is going to focus on the obscure, on the rare elements in the distribution. Why? Because it's a very important insight that the stuff that didn't survive at all is probably going to look more like the rare things in the distribution than the highly abundant things in the distribution. Homer, for instance, is probably unlike the poets that didn't survive in Greek pathology. That's very important. This, by the way, an insight that goes all the way back to Alan Turing. I'll say more about that in a minute. But the stuff that is not visible anymore, it's a very good assumption to assume that it's going to look more like the rare, obscure items in your distribution. There's two numbers that we're going to specifically focus on today, and that is F1 and F2. And here, this is a distribution where F1 is 41. So that means that in this sample, 41 species are a singleton, have been cited only once, exactly once. And then we also have F2 for the doubletons. And these are the species that were cited exactly twice. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to represent this, we're going to model this distribution in a pretty radically different way. We are going to just look at F1 and F2. We're going to count how many F1s do we have and how many F2s we have. And the quantity of interest here is really F0. F0 is items or species that live in a certain area, but that have been cited exactly 0 times. And this is hard, right? Because we can't observe F0. So this sort of count information you can model with a statistical distribution called the Poisson distribution. If you've ever done a statistics class, you've probably heard of the Poisson distribution. It's basically a way of expressing the likelihood that something will take on a certain integer value. It's very common if you're working with count data with integers. And this Poisson distribution has a mathematical expression. I'm not going to show that because it's really complicated, but what Anshao found out is that you can apply a little hack to that formula, a trick. And that's actually a well-known trick in mathematics. It's called the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. It's one of the most foundational formulas, they often say, of recent mathematics. And if you apply that little hack, the following regularity emerges. You say that you take the square of F1 and you divide that by 2 times F2. And basically, what you can then derive is that F0, this holy grail that we were after, this dark number, if you will, is going to be larger than that number. So why is that important? We can plug in our numbers. And basically what this tells us is that F0 in this case, at least will have been 44. And this is very important. So I was saying Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. You can see that here too. So you don't have an equal sign. You have a greater than. So what this is really giving you is a lower bound on the number of undetected species, because you can apply this little hack to the Poisson distribution. And what is very cool about this, and we don't often get to say that in the humanities, this is universally valid. This is a mathematical proof. This is always correct. You have to be okay with the fact that it's a lower bound. The number could always be higher, but this is true. It's a universally valid estimate. I'll come back to that in the second part of today, but what is important is that you really remember that we're working with a lower bound and that this number could be higher. So remember the inequality. So Anshao later found out that the foundations for this work, for this little hack, were already laid in Bletchley Park by Alan Turing. Have you seen the biopic, The Imitation Game? Beautiful movie. And there, Alan Turing and his student Good were working on decoding the German Enigma machines. And there too, he was constantly confronted with these new messages coming in, and he needed a way of dealing or estimating the probability that something came in and that it was a word that he hadn't previously seen before. And basically there he did a lot of mathematical work that ultimately would lead to this Chow-1 estimator. So yeah, it's very interesting how the Second World War again pops up in this story. Alan Turing, great guy. So as I said, this is a purely mathematical derivation. And in this formula, you can see that there's nothing specific to animals or to plants. So it works in ecology for this unseen species model. But people have actually found out that this is very, very widely applicable. So the only thing that you need is a collection of counts, or an assemblage, as they call it, of which you know that it is diverse, hyperdiverse, but you know that it has been undersampled, that there's a lot of stuff that isn't in your sample. As soon as you have data that looks like that, you can apply this estimator to estimate the number of types, the number of species, or the number of texts, as we will do, that haven't survived. And people have been applying these estimators in very crazy domains. For instance, to estimate the number of undetected software bugs in a piece of software. So there too, you can go to Stack Overflow and you look at how many times a bug has been reported. Again, you get abundance data, and you can estimate how many bugs are still undetected in software. It's an interesting way to measure the quality, you could say, of piece of software. Another application is in criminology. I'll talk more about criminology in the second part today. But there, often what you want to look at is underreported crime, drug use in cities, domestic violence that has gone unreported. There they call this specifically the dark numbers. It's something that you often read about in the media. In the 70s, there was even a Soviet astronomer who independently derived this little hack that Chow also used. And he used that to estimate the total number of flare stars in the Pleiades. So that's, again, a completely different domain. But there, too, you can count the stars. You know that you're not observing all of the stars. You can apply the estimator to estimate how many stars went undetected. So this is important. This is very widely applicable. You just need token counts of types. The only thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is a lower bound. Could always be more, but definitely this much. So we applied this method to cultural heritage, and more specifically, these medieval romances that I was talking about earlier. We did that in a very large collaboration with domain experts from all over Europe. This is Folgert, by the way, and this is Anne Chow, the biostatistician who joined us for the study. We were very honored that she wanted to do that. And so we applied this to medieval literature, and we looked at 6 literature. We looked at 3 island literatures and 3 continental literatures. English, Irish, and Icelandic were the literatures that we called insular. And then we had German, we had Dutch and French. Those were the continental literatures. And what we did was we collected abundance data. So basically we counted how many manuscripts do we still have each narrative. And we tried to use pre-existing resources as much as possible, because sometimes counting works can be controversial, if you will. Like, for instance, in Germany, you have a great tool, the Handschriftencensus. Maybe it's something that you have heard of. It's really great work. But we basically collected abundance data, and then we applied the estimating. So in our paper, we focused on 2 things: the loss of works, those are the gray circles, and the loss of documents, which was the book column. Today, I'm simply going to focus on the loss of works for the simple reason that this is what will matter in the second part of the presentation. So as I said, this is blue sky research. In medieval philology, there was really, we didn't have a very clear idea of how much was lost. So sometimes what you have is that authors will refer to other authors that we don't know anymore, but it doesn't happen all that often. So you could count that, but that's going to be even much more of a lower bound than Chow-1 is. So this was pretty new in philology. There was an interesting precursor in an article by Egge and Poot, who developed a similar kind of estimator, but for printed works. The problem there was that if you print a book, you often do that in multiple copies, and the estimation problem becomes very different, because you have to estimate also what the printing run is of these books, etc. So here you see a curve that sort of sums up our main finding. And this is in ecology, what they call a species accumulation curve. What you have here is manuscripts or documents. What you have on the vertical axis is the number of works. So what we see here is in this literature, if we sample more documents, how many works do we find? And what we had in our data, you can see the little circle there, that's the empirical situation that we have today. So we counted 799 S-ops, observed species, or works that we still know, stuff like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in N manuscripts 3,648. So that is the number that we have. But what you see is that there's an extrapolation here that Chow gives us, and it tells us if we keep on sampling manuscripts, if we were to retrieve them all, how many works are going to be in there? You can see that this has an asymptotic form. The curve starts to flatten out at a certain point. And what that tells you is that at least 371 of these works were not detected, according to this estimator. If you've estimated F0, you can sum that with S-ops, and then you know how many works existed in total, minimally in this literature, 1170. And once you have that number, you can start calculating the survival rate. And this will tell you that maximally 68% of the medieval works have survived. And here, this is something that you might have to convince yourself of. If Chow 1 is a lower bound, this number is an upper bound. This is the maximum survival ratio of these works. And that number, it seems pretty high, to be honest. And what you will see in the next slide is that there's actually very stark differences across the individual literatures that we looked at. You can see that in the little chart here. So German, for instance, German literature is huge in comparison to Middle Dutch literature, for instance. And what you see that the survival ratio of these German works is much, much higher than, for instance, English. English did the worst in our sample here, very low survival rate. Even lower than Dutch and French. What was also remarkable is that Icelandic and Irish were pretty small literatures, but they had a comparatively high survival rate. In the paper, we make a big deal out of that because there's an interesting analogy with biology. So island cultures are often really interested in ecology because they have a special sort of species richness. Like if you think of Darwin and his big turtles, he found those on islands as well. And nature does interesting things on islands. What you see is that islands often manage to preserve their biological heritage in a good way. What we here found is that maybe something similar is true of the cultural heritage in islands. But I'm going to skim over that. There's a whole section on that in the paper. If you're interested in that, feel free to read the paper on that. So this was sort of the introduction, a long introduction of where this research came from. Here you can see the bishop's mitre, by the way, the sexy story on it. We have a website, we have a small documentary that you can watch online, so that should be fun. And also we have a software library. So I hear that many people here code in Python. So we have a software package for Python that implements all of these models, and it's really easy if you would have your own data to apply these methods to that data. And back to the Second World War. Do you know this meme from social media? Depends a bit on the audience that I'm presenting to. In some corners of the humanities, people have never seen this. Do I have to, or do you want to explain it maybe? Or, yeah, so this is like the classic illustration of survivorship bias. And this very interesting analogy is also like there's a famous case study on the NBA. So for instance, you would think that tall people are better at basketball. If you're better at basketball, you're going to score more points. But if you look at the NBA, there's no such a correlation. And you would think that, oh, maybe it isn't important that you're tall to be in the NBA. That's because the people who are not tall in the NBA, they're compensating something. And they managed to get through the selection, and they still made it to the NBA, even though they're not tall. So just looking at that data is dangerous at face value, because there you have survivorship bias. It's a bit the same as with the airplanes. A statistician who discovered this was Abraham Wald, working for the RAF. Great illustration. But so what I was talking about in the first case study is not very interesting. So you can say, okay, there's 44 romances that didn't survive in Middle Dutch, but we don't know anything about them. So we say something about the size of the unobserved part of that population, but we don't know what that literature looked like. We don't know what drives survival. So what are the drivers, what explains whether a text is going to survive or not? And that's what I'll be talking about in the second part today. And this is, as I promised, I think, a real historical case study. Beyond the register, demographic modeling of arrest patterns in a specific year in Brussels in the 19th century. And this is a study that we recently published in CHR, Computational Humanities Research Conference, a great workshop that we recently had. And for that, we collaborated with Margot de Koster, who is a real historian, and she's a police historian. She's basically working on historical criminology. A year ago, I had no clue that that even existed, historical criminology. It's really interesting. So here too, we set out from the idea that measuring cultural diversity is important, especially for us people working in with past data, but that this is complicated because many things cannot be observed anymore. How do we study the unobserved? Good question. So unseen species models seem to offer an answer here to the issue that we are constantly underestimating the diversity of past cultures. And I've explained about CHA1, this estimator that we've used and applied to cultural heritage. So here, I'm coming back to this problem that we have with this lower bound estimate. So in the sample, in the historical record, we have an observed diversity, a number of stories. And we know that that observed diversity suffers from undersampling, and that the true diversity must have been much larger. What we're trying to estimate here is how much larger it has been. What we can do is apply the CHA1 estimate. And CHA1 is great, but it is a lower bound. So it's telling you this number is going to be smaller than this one, but it doesn't tell you how much smaller it is. What we're trying to do in this paper is come up with this. We're trying to bring the original CHA1 estimate a bit closer to the true diversity. So if we can achieve this, that's an even better estimate than the one that we had already. So this makes sense. This is a figure that's going to come back a couple of times. This is what we see. This is what we should see. This is what we had. We're trying to get here. So as I said, this CHA1 method is based on this Poisson distribution. And this Poisson distribution is a bit of an issue, because in this Poisson distribution, what you are going to assume by default is that each of the species that you're counting have an equal detection rate. But that's problematic because we know that is not the case. It's easier to spot an elephant than a snow leopard. And because of that, that actually helps explain why CHA1 is a lower bound, why CHA1 is so conservative, why it gives you a lower bound. What we're going to do in this paper is basically embrace the fact that the detection rate can be different for species. Large animals are easier to spot. Loud animals or colorful animals are easier to spot.
Hi.
We're going to try to integrate that. That kind of information in our model. Okay, so this is again a technical slide. Bear with me. So remember that we were working with a Poisson distribution that characterizes these numbers, and we were specifically interested in these ones and twos, singletons, doubletons, F1, F0. So indeed, you can characterize this as a Poisson distribution, but the problem here is that we're only looking in CHA1 at two numbers, whereas a Poisson distribution would cover the entire range of integers, if you will. So what we have here is a special Poisson distribution. It's a truncated one because we chop off all of the numbers except for F1 and F2. And there's a very smart mathematician who's reasoning again about this, Dankma Bunning. And the Poisson distribution has a single parameter called lambda, or the rate. If you look at a normal distribution, for instance, the Gaussian distribution, a bell curve, that has two parameters. It has a mean and a variance. The Poisson distribution also has a parameter, only one, namely the lambda. So that's an important number. In a truncated Poisson distribution, you can rewrite lambda as such. You can see that in that term to the right, you need to estimate P. What is P? P is a very simple number. So basically the probability that something is going to be a doubleton instead of a singleton. If you can estimate that probability, a lot more information becomes available. And this is simple, estimating P1, because what you can do is use a simple linear model. Have you worked with linear models at all? So yeah, so it's hard for me to estimate your background here. So basically what we're going to do here is implement a binomial model. Binomial model is a coin flip. So you're trying to estimate whether something is going to be heads or tails. You're going to do that on the basis of extra information that you have about these coins. Some coins are going to be more likely to be heads than tails. Some coins, some species are going to be more likely to be a doubleton than a singleton. If we can build such a model, and that's a very simple binary model, we're simply trying to guess whether something has been spotted once or twice. If you find something that differentiates singletons from doubletons, that gives you a lot of information about what the F-zeros look like. Why? Because we know that the F-zeros look more like the F1s than the F2s. What we're going to add here now are covariates, stuff that we can include in our model that is going to help us to guess whether something is a doubleton or a singleton. And that's a simple extension. Folgert wrote this. I don't think it's that simple, but it's kind of simple. This lets you study why some things tend to survive better than other things. You can look at the effect of these covariates in this model. And you, as a historian, have the choice among a wide range of features that you could include. When you're working with text, you can look at topic or genre. When you're working with people, you can include demographics like age, etc. You can look at the historical context. And this is going to give you insight into what gets observed and what doesn't get observed. So here, our case study comes from a specific year in Brussels, a unique source, about the Amigo prison. Have you ever been to Brussels? Visited the Grand Place? So very close to the Grand Place, there's a very luxurious hotel, the Amigo Hotel. If Brad Pitt comes to Brussels, this is the hotel that he stays in. All the paparazzi are staying outside. But this fancy hotel used to be a prison back in the day. And what they have is a unique source that records all of the people who were imprisoned in that prison in 1879 to 1880. And it's a super detailed register where all the information seems to be present. And at that time, most of the people who are imprisoned there are so-called vagrants or homeless people, criminals, you could say, or rather criminalized people. And the people who stay there in that hotel, which was back then a prison, they came in two categories. It could be that the police had arrested them on the streets because they were causing trouble of some sort. And that's what we call a forceful entry. So this was against their volition. Police arrested them and put them in the prison. But people could also go for a nuit sur demande, where someone who was in the city, who was in big trouble, could ask, hey, can I spend the night here? And that's because the functioning of the police has changed a lot. Back then, the police was a much more sociable organization, you could say, where they were also actively trying to help people. Of course, in the data, we have to make a very strong difference between being arrested against your own will and you going to the police yourself, asking to spend the night there. That's an important distinction, but I'll come back to that. What is nice about this source is that we have very detailed demographic characteristics of the people who spent the night there. We know their age, we know their gender, we know where they were born, etc. And these are the sort of demographic variables that we're going to use and see whether we can model how vulnerable people were to arrest. So was the police biased, for instance, against specific kinds of criminalized? So here in this case, what we see, and this is of course crucial, is that many people spent a night in the prison multiple times. There was recidivism. And you could say that that gives you a count, that gives you a reciting as ecologists. You can see these visualizations. In gray, you see all of the arrests. And then for specific individuals, you can see that there's red lines, and many people tend to have been imprisoned in the Amigo prison multiple times. This is an interesting finding that Folgert did in the data. I'm a local from Brussels, and Kestemont is not a very common name in that area. We know the birthplace of Marie-Thérèse Kestemont, and she was actually born in the same village that my paternal grandfather came from. So it's very likely that this person is related to me. And I often joke about this on social media, but it's really not a funny story, because she was arrested for prostitution. And I mean, it's obvious that she was like banned from the family, ended up in Brussels where she had to prostitute herself, and wasn't helped by the family, because here she was arrested twice, shortly, then she popped up again here in the data. So it's actually kind of a sad story that also makes you realize the harsh reality behind these numbers that we are treating, perhaps in a disrespectful way. In that respect. But it was funny to see my own name in the archives. So what is our main research question here? We know that the police is trying to arrest criminals, but we also know that they never manage to arrest all criminals. What we're trying to estimate is the dark number, the true population of people that they might have arrested, but that in the end they didn't arrest. That's the dark number that we're trying to estimate. What we're specifically interested in is whether across demographic groups we see a policing bias. For instance, women. What would the police do with women? Would they be arrested more often than men or not? That's a very simple research question, but it's very much related to, for instance, the survival of this medieval literature. Does the genre of a text affect its survival? Here you have a very similar question. Does the gender of a homeless person, does that affect their vulnerability to arrest? So here are these covariates that are showing on the complex model slide. So we have the age. So there we know that there must have been a differential treatment of people across different age groups. So sometimes children were imprisoned. So that's an interesting group. Gender. So what we see is that women appeared much less in the records, but often they had a higher repeat of recidivism. That would be like, they would show repeat offenses. Another very interesting thing is origin. So we know, for instance, whether people were Brussels native or whether they're immigrants. So one of the people in this data set, for instance, came from Borneo. Sometimes they came from really far. And in the literature, what people often assumed is that there was a negative policing bias against immigrants. So that was something interesting to explore. Were they more likely to arrest people who weren't local? Another thing is previous voluntary stays. So as I said about this nuit sur demande, people could, on their own initiative, go to the prison and ask, hey, I'm in trouble, can I spend the night there? It's interesting to wonder that made them known to the police, made them known as socially vulnerable. How did that affect the probability that they would be arrested at a certain point after that? Another thing is family connections. So what we often see is that the police were targeting specific families who were hanging around, and often they would be co-arrested, for instance. There was a immigrant family from Naples at that point, for instance. You see that people with the same family name who must have been related keep on reappearing in the document. So these were the main factors that we looked into. Okay, so back to this little slide here. So we have the observed diversity. That's the unique number of individuals who were imprisoned in that period. Then we have our dark number, the true diversity. And we can have our Chow-1 estimate. That's what we would get for the very simple model where we assume that everybody has an equal arrest rate. And then we have our improved estimate. That improved estimate should be higher than SHA-1. If that doesn't happen, if it would be smaller, something is off, is wrong. So we need this number to increase for the special model that we apply. So I'm going, on the next slide, I'm going to show the performance of multiple models. We have a simple intercept model, which is a kind of baseline. And this is basically SHA-1. This is what SHA-1 would give you if you don't include any of the extra information that we inject into the model. And then we included various combinations of these demographic predictors like gender and age, etc. And then we also have a full model where we basically throw in everything that we have. Here you see a visualization with the model formulas to the right. As you can see, Y1 is the simple intercept model. That's going to be the same as SHA-1. And this is the most powerful, the most complex model that we ran. And what you see in these weights that we assigned here is that that is also the best model. This is best at guessing whether somebody would spend 1 night or 2 nights in prison. So we know that all of these variables, sex, age, the prior stay in the Amigo, their origin, whether they were local or not, and whether they had family connections or not, all of that helps explain whether someone would be arrested once or twice. And that's important because that means that we can use all of these parameters to improve our child estimate. And this is, so remember that I said that if this is working, the new number that we get should be higher than the SHA-1 estimate. This is the simple naive one. And that's this line. And indeed, for the most complex models, we indeed get a population estimate that is higher. This is good. This is what we wanted. It should be higher. Here we have some model plots that show you what the effect is of a particular covariate on PF2. PF2 is the probability that you're going to be cited twice instead of once. I'll just stick to a couple of simple examples. If you look at sex, for instance, if you have a doubleton in the data, often it was a woman. We see that males appear much more often, but often only once. Women appear less frequently, but when they appear, they tend to be repeat offenders. So what that tells you is that there is indeed a policing bias against women. They monitor the few women that are part of that population. They monitor them more closely. They will end up more easily in the Amigo. Same for origin here, for instance, where you see that the policing bias is in fact geared much more towards the local population than people coming from abroad, people with a migration status. This is the opposite of what we thought would happen based on the literature. I'm not sure how to interpret this, but people who were local tended to be arrested more easily. And also here, this is called the forest plot. This shows you the effect in another way of these variables. This was run in a Bayesian framework. It's a specific kind of statistics. And here what you could say, if the range of a parameter doesn't intersect with 0, you could say that it offers a meaningful contribution to the model. And here, all of these parameters, they do something, right? Because they don't intersect with 0. Prior, for instance, has the strongest positive effect. And this is a bit tragic. So if you went to the police asking for help on your own initiative, that really increased your chances of being arrested afterwards. So you're basically increasing your own social vulnerability by going to the police. So in our sample, in total, we had 5,610 known individuals. If you apply SHA-1 without the smart extension, that will be raised to almost 17,000. Now with the improved estimates, we get a higher number, 18,238. So that is what is visualized here. The observed diversity, what is in the data, the simple SHA-1, and then we manage to up that number a little bit. Many of the things here I've said already, but there's a higher detection rate for women, more policing effort bias geared towards that genre, even though there were less women in the population than men. Policing bias against local people. They seem to care less, you could say, about foreigners. And priors had a very strong effect there. If you went yourself to the police for a nuit sur demande, that really increased your chance of being arrested afterwards. So I'm going to conclude here. So the dark number that we were looking at is substantial. So even if the police was actively policing, they only caught, you could say, 31% of the people that they could have caught. That's a significant number. It also tells you something about the population of homeless people at that time. So these were difficult times in Brussels. And what we also know is that this invisible part of the population, people who weren't arrested, so that's not a random subset of the population. We know that women were monitored more intensely. We know that locals were more vulnerable to arrest than migrants. And people who contacted police on their own initiative had higher arrest chances afterwards. Our data is a bit challenging. So this was like a first case study into getting more insight into what explains, what drives survival, what drives detection and under detection. So one problem that we often had in this kind of cultural data set is that we have one inflation. So what that means is that F1 is crazy high in comparison to other data sets. And we have to take that into account into our models more. But whenever we've looked at a data set from the cultural domain, the number of F1s, of unique sightings, is higher often than you would expect on the basis of ecological data sets, for instance. That's something interesting, might be more typical for culture versus biology. Another problem is that it is estimated that there's a very huge population turnover in European cities at that moment. So about 10% of the population of an entire city could change in that period. I don't think our model is very well equipped to deal with that. We simply ignore that. We assume that this population of homeless people is constant, but what we see is that that is not the case. And there's other issues. So for instance, that sometimes a vagrant would be arrested, then they would be sent out to a colony outside the city temporarily. So we often see that they return after that. But here in this model, what we assume is that someone stays the night in prison, and that the day afterwards they can be arrested again by the police. Of course, if you're being sent to a colony for 3 months, that doesn't. So plenty of issues, but still, I have the feeling that we were able to advance the model a little bit with this case study. And of course, what the larger relevance of this case study is that it gives you a principled way to talk about things that you can't observe anymore in the historic record. It gives you a principled framework and a language, if you will, to talk about representation and underrepresentation in historical biases. So here we go further than the study with the medieval manuscripts, where we say this many texts are missing. Here, what you can do is actually explain why things are missing, what the unobserved part of your population in reality looked like. And I think for historians, it is always interesting to talk about the mechanisms that underlie invisibility, especially invisibility in the archives, which we know is a biased something. Okay, that's it. Thank you.